Well, welcome. Thank you for coming. Tonight, I think if some of you read the little descriptions or things like that, partially what I'm going to do tonight is give kind of a general overview, and it's very wide-ranging across a lot of different ways that I see contemporary American literature starting to sort of blur some of the typical boundaries that we have. Part of my reason for doing this is because starting next year and for the following 2 years, I'll have a position in the English department that allows me some time to develop some new research and some new courses. And so already next fall, I'm trying to put together a class on hybrid literature. So part of what I want to do today is sort of put just some general questions out there, some general ideas, some general observations, and then perhaps in the question and answer period, I can even do it as a little bit of a workshop and hear from you guys, because in many ways, I'm just observing what's going on for you, and so you guys know it better than I do. So, I'd love to get some ideas and some feedback as well. The title of the talk is Mashups, Remixes, and Hybrids, and hopefully that will make sense as we go. The new American literature, I apologize to any of you who expected cats. There was a disclaimer at the bottom of the poster that said cats not included. So I'll go ahead and jump in with this idea that we live in an era of increasingly blurred boundaries and collapsing definitions of categories that range across culture and literature. In terms of culture, art, and literature, this is an era where, for instance, many of our best young writers, artists, musicians are going to work in the video game industry, right? Where the most trusted name in news is a stand-up comedian, right? Sadly leaving us, for hopefully better things in the future. And where, Abraham Lincoln, our revered forefather, we've got a big statue of him out there, is hunting vampires. Right? This era is one in which there are few distinctions left between high and low culture, right? Where those boundaries are constantly blurred, where there's little that's often considered elevated anymore, unassailable. Anybody who grew up on The Simpsons or South Park, we like to slaughter our sacred cows, and there's very little distinction there. We also live in an era of increasingly immersive video media and technologies, which again blurs the line often between real and online or virtual. And it's also a world of global exchanges and interchanges, primarily fueled by some of that new media and technologies, where literal borders are no longer in play in many ways, where populations and cultures intermingle and blend, which complicates notions of local and national identity and culture. What we consider to be American culture is now in some ways a hybrid form with a lot of other cultures around the world. In terms of the relationship to American literature, which is going to be my focus today, a lot of this blurring boundaries leads to shifts in both form and content in new kinds of American literature. And it raises questions of what counts as literature in this era, an era of e-books, iBooks, and apps, of Twitter and Facebook and fan fiction, graphic novels. Also, as I just mentioned, raises questions of what counts as American in this era, an era of diversity and globalization, of cross-cultural pollination. These are at the center of some of the questions that I want to explore today, and just again give kind of a broad overview of how I see some of these challenging questions and some of these blurred boundaries as shaping American literature, and perhaps shaping and reshaping how we need to think about ourselves as readers, as writers, as teachers, as future publishers, perhaps, how I see this happening. And I'm going to focus on it in those three main areas that I just discussed. In terms of form and content, as far as that collapse of high and low culture, the impact of new media and technology on the new American literature, and the impact of those global exchanges and interchanges of that diversity and that global cross-pollination that I mentioned. So we start first with that collapse of high and low culture. And a lot of this, as I'm going to talk about it at least, really goes back to some of the challenges to official narratives in the United States that began to pop up, particularly at mid-century. You enter the era of the 60s and the counterculture, and you start to really question not only the government, when we've got Vietnam, we've got conspiracies about a series of political assassinations, we have Watergate after that, where culture-wide there begins to be a shift in how we accept our official narratives, whether those be what the president tells us or whether it's, to quote a famous book title, The Lies My Teacher Told Me. The ways in which we receive our culture and define our culture. And this distrust of foundational narratives, starts to filter into American literature at this era, and start to reconsider those official narratives, start to rewrite those official narratives, start to look at them from a different angle. And it also causes a shift in the kind of stories that are being told, challenging what counts, as I said, as culture and literature, what we consider to be an important story, challenges to the canon at this time, as well as challenges to form, how these stories are written, and a lot of experimentation with that. In addition, these reconsiderations allow a greater diversity in literature and a much greater inclusivity of perspectives based on gender and sex and sexual orientation, class and race, and a trend towards reimagining our history as well as our literature from those greater variety of perspectives. So I throw these images up here because it starts with reconsiderations of our historical narratives. And, for a long time, and this is a painting demonstrating our manifest destiny and the westward progress, that story, of course, starts to get reconsidered, right? No longer the celebration of manifest destiny, but questions of, contact with Native Americans, degradation of the natural world as part of this process. Again, reconsidering that narrative that had been so foundational to our sense of American culture prior to this time. Similarly, our founding fathers, this is the era when we recognize that the same men who wrote that all men were created equal are also slaveholders. I have a picture, of course, of Thomas Jefferson being the famous example of this as his affair with Sally Hemings comes to light and again causes a bit of reconsideration of, again, a very foundational narrative about who we are and what we stand for. And as I said, these same kinds of questioning and reimaginings filters over into literature. And one of the famous early examples of, again, mid-century of that is Anne Sexton's book of poetry, Transformations. And Anne Sexton, not for this book, but for others, won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry. And in 1971, she released Transformations, which is a whole series of poems that reimagine Grimm's fairy tales. Now, this is something with which we are very familiar now because it spurs a whole genre of fractured fairy tales, whether that be anything from Shrek, right, all the way up to those of you who like to watch Once Upon a Time, right? Well, wait a second. Let's reconsider that story from this other angle. And Anne Sexton does this in poetry in 1971, and just a brief snippet from her poem version of Cinderella. Cinderella and the prince lived, they say, happily ever after, like two dolls in a museum case, never bothered by diapers or dust, never arguing over the timing of an egg, never telling the same story twice, never getting a middle-aged spread, their darling smiles pasted on for eternity, regular Bobbsey twins, that story. And you see here just a sample of, again, not just taking the easy route and picking up something that's already been written and playing with it, but really fundamentally questioning some of the notions that underlie these foundational narratives. And fairy tales for many cultures are foundational narratives. So reconsidering it from the perspective of gender, for instance, from sexuality, and there's several other examples. Other prominent examples of these kinds of retellings, reimaginings in literature. One of the most famous examples, of course, is Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, which came out, I think, in 1966. And it's the sort of prequel to Jane Eyre. And those of you who know it know Jane Eyre. This is Jean Rhys's sort of post-colonial feminist rewriting of that story from the perspective of the mad woman in the attic, telling her story and reimagining Jane Eyre. This is very frequently these days on any of the sort of top 100 novels in the English language lists. It's considered to be its own sort of mainstay of literature, but itself is a retelling of Jane Eyre, another foundational text. More contemporary examples, A Thousand Acres won the Pulitzer Prize in 1991 by Jane Smiley, and it replaces King Lear in an Iowa cornfield. And it retells that story from the perspective of the older daughter, from the Goneril figure, from those of you familiar with King Lear. Wins the Pulitzer in 1991. Even more contemporary, Geraldine Brooks won the 2006 Pulitzer Prize for her novel, March. Anybody familiar with this one? You're familiar with this one? It's a retelling of Little Women, right? The March family, except from the perspective of the absent father. Of course, Little Women is famous for the father not being a part of the story because he's supposedly off at the Civil War. Well, this follows his story. One of the things that I want to point out here, well, one more example. The most sort of prominent, popular example when it comes to literature is, of course, Wicked, right? Both the novel, which came out in 1995, and then the subsequent musical adaptation in 2003. This itself has become a cultural institution, as many people, especially at Millikin, know. And it's, of course, a reimagining of L. Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz. But especially for those of you who've read the novel, right? And the musical, I love the musical, it's great, but it doesn't have nearly the depth of the novel. Gregory Maguire turns L. Frank Baum's simple fairy tale into a really complex socio-political landscape in Oz, and it really challenges notions of everything, of course, from the notions of good versus evil, but as well as sexuality, gender, race. It reimagines, and of course it's turned into a whole series, the Wicked series. He's written 3 other ones as well. But the thing I want to emphasize about this is these examples are not examples of writers just rehashing something old or taking the easy way out, as I mentioned before. But fundamentally questioning some of the values that are communicated through traditional literature. Rethinking not just our historical tales, but also our inherited tales. Right? L. Frank Baum, when he wrote The Wizard of Oz, said that this was an American fairy tale, something he wrote specifically to capture for American children how we think and feel. Well, Gregory Maguire sort of deconstructs that and says, well, wait a second, what lessons are we actually getting about, oh, that woman with the green skin, of course she's bad, right? She's got green skin. Well, Gregory Maguire makes that a sort of racial and gender commentary. Right? So really fundamentally questioning the values, not just rehashing old tales. Perhaps that same claim can't be made for a more contemporary version of this, which is what I call mashup literature, and I'm not the first person to call it that. But the current popularity of this genre at least points to our willingness to engage with it. Now, to illustrate what mashup literature is, I give you the grandfather of mashup literature, Seth Grahame-Smith. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies becomes the most contemporary example. And I ironically call him the grandfather of this because he founded this whole latest genre, and there are dozens more of these, not just written by him, but others, because this was a New York Times bestseller, like Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, right? But the phrase, of course, comes from music, right? Mashups. That notion of taking disparate elements and putting them together in new ways. A lot of this relies on the fact that these classics are now in the open source, right, are in the public domain, and so they can be played with in this way. But basically, he takes these traditional narratives and mashes them up with fantastical elements. And as I said, he sort of founds the genre, at least in a popular sense and in a publication sense. But he sort of became a celebrity and built his career around this. He's also the esteemed mind behind Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. He also wrote this, again, reimagining historical narratives in this kind of fantastical way. And as I said, although I would not dare to make the same argument I just made about Pulitzer Prize-winning novels, about challenging values and things like that, I think, and he would agree, that this is entertainment. But these were both New York Times bestsellers. And again, if nothing else, it indicates our willingness to challenge these stories, to play with them, to put zombies into Pride and Prejudice, right? To allow Abraham Lincoln, and of course, people may have seen the film adaptation itself. A popular film, again, maybe not a quality film, but a popular film, which again, that popularity means a lot, right? It means our willingness as a culture to accept this. As I said, there's a lot of spin-offs of these. An even more mashed up genre, if people have seen, it's been very popular in the last year or so, is Ian Doescher has started issuing William Shakespeare's Star Wars books. There's 3 of them out, where he uses Shakespeare's tropes and language to retell the story of Star Wars. So I don't know how many different ways that's mashed up, right? But this genre has become very, very popular. And again, it indicates that although this may be a novelty and it may be sort of less serious, it does indicate that we're willing as a culture to explode these sort of sacred texts, to reimagine them.